So Juan, you will start?
Yeah.
And then I talk.
Buenas tardes desde la Escuela Española de Historia y Arqueología del CSIC en Roma. Bienvenidos nuevamente a todos a esta nueva conferencia de nuestro seminario Online Talks, el seminario que realizamos ya desde hace algunos meses junto a mis colegas Miriam Cubas de la Universidad de Alcalá y a Harry Robson de la Universidad de York. En la parte técnica siempre agradecemos la ayuda de Matteo Benatti, que está siempre detrás de la cámara, por así decirlo, y en la organizativa los compañeros del CSIC en Roma, que llevan todas las redes sociales, a Esther Barrondo, a Valeria Beolchini y a su director y codirector, Antonio Pizzo y Elena García. As you know, this conference will be recorded by the YouTube of our center. You can send the questions by YouTube also. Thank you, Detlef, for accepting our invitation. I want to introduce the professor Detlef Gronenborn. He is one of the best known researchers on the Neolithic of Central Europe, and his research is ever a reference for many of us. Professor Gronenborn is a research curator in the department, at the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum in Mainz, and professor at the Gutenberg University, also in Mainz. His curriculum is incredible, it's amazing. He has been a professor at different universities, Florida, Frankfurt, Göttingen, Bamberg, and Mainz. And he's author of them, a lot of papers, books, projects, etc. Again, thank you, Detlef. You have more or less 40-45 minutes. In the end, you will be able to answer the questions. And okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation. We will start right away because I've prepared many slides, complicated slides that is. So we'll see how I get along with the time frame. You might know this map. It shows the Neolithization process beginning in the Near East and extending up to the furthest extension that we have in the or the beginning of the furthest extension that we have in Europe. Later during the Iron Age, some occurrences of farming happen here in this area, but this is the initial and most important part of what is one of the really major historical periods during the entire history of anatomically modern humans on this globe. So it is no small matter that we deal with today, and it requires some intensive looks to understand it, or attempts to understand it. What is evident from this publication, which came out last year, and where they have various models of the development of the Holocene temperature curves across the globe, is that no matter what algorithm is behind any of these temperature curves, the Neolithic really spans the warmest period during the Holocene. And that is no wonder, because warm temperatures are necessary, of course, for the development of agriculture. That was automatically, I don't know why that happened. What we can also see is that the Holocene temperatures peak during the period around 6,000 BP, that is 4,000 calibrated PP. So that right in the middle of the European Neolithic, that middle falls into the warmest period during the Holocene of the globe, only surpassed, of course, during the very recent developments that we currently experience. Another fascinating aspect is that our today's population in Europe, that is all the people that are within our digital group here and all the people that you see outside on the streets, they all sort of the population diversity all goes back to the period of the Neolithic. After the initial spread of the anatomically modern Europe, of the anatomically modern humans into Europe, anything between, now they consider 50,000 to 40,000 years ago. Ever since then, the next major population influx into Europe happens during the early, oh no, I'm sorry, I just realized that I have automatic changer. Would it make sense to go back into the file and look whether I can delete it, or should we just live with it? Hello? Anyone out there?
No, yes, it's okay. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll try. If it becomes too burdensome, we'll do something about it. So, what the early Neolithic period, the spread of farming is characterized by, is the spread of, as we now know, or have known for about 15 years, with certainty known, is a spread of a population from Western Anatolia into Europe. And this population then mingles and intermixes with the indigenous hunter-gatherer population, and the Neolithic finally sort of is closed up with a further, that is an older publication, with a further population influx from the steppe region. So basically all the populations that constitute our population spectrum, our biological population spectrum in Europe today, all these influxes happened during the 3,000 years of the European Neolithic. And basically these populations have been composed out of a composition that our colleagues from DNA call the Western hunter-gatherers. Then there's an Eastern indigenous population called the Eastern hunter-gatherers. And then we have the influx of the Anatolian component that makes up most of the populations that brought with them the practice of farming. So far for the Neolithic. However, if we want to understand the Neolithic in full, with all these different population compositions, we need to look slightly before the period of the Neolithic into what we generally call the Late Mesolithic. Those few people that are specialists of this period, those few people know that the Late Mesolithic has been and is continuously characterized by a blade production technology, which has its origins presumably somewhere in Mongolia, at the somewhere deep back during the peak period of the glacial. And from then on, the production technique of these regular blades, as they are called, expands into the New World and also westward. And sometime with the beginning of the Late Mesolithic, this technology, together with different types of microliths, also make it into Western Europe. To a number of colleagues, this has always been a fascinating subject, and we have followed it up over the years. And slightly more recent research has shown that the spread of this Late Mesolithic regular blade technique is separated from earlier Mesolithic technologies by a climate event that is yet still a bit under-researched. It is called the 9.2 event or the 9.3 event or the 7.3 calibrated BC event. More recent research has shown that it correlates with monsoon fluctuations in Eastern Asia, so that we at least have for the Northern Hemisphere, we have a half global event that sort of ruptures these Mesolithic societies and divides them technologically between the more local, regional, early Neolithic, early Mesolithic technologies, and separates them from the regular blades technology that make their way into Europe from the east. And if we plot this on a map, we can see that happening here as well, with a 7.2 event sort of separating the advance of the technology up to this barrier, and from then on thereafter, they make their way further westwards. And the famous or infamous 6.2 events, it just separates sort of the spread of this regular blades technique into the northern region. It has never really reached the UK, possibly because the British Channel was already in place at the time. Very recent research has shown that there's a certain correlation with the expansion of the eastern hunter-gatherers from this region further westward. So while we have looked at the spread of this technology for 30 years, we now begin to grasp that that the spread of this technology was somehow paralleled by a population expansion of these eastern hunter-gatherers eastward at the beginning of the 7th millennium calibrated BC. And if you look in the publications further east, you can also see that there's an influx of an Iranian Caucasus ancestry into Eastern Anatolia around the same time. So what I want to say with this is that population dynamics and population fluctuations and maybe migrations or gene flow is not something that is restricted to the Neolithic, but it happens, I'm sorry for this, but it happens it happens already during the period of the early Holocene, and it sort of determines the further Neolithization process through determining the composition of the indigenous population that takes part in the entire process during the following millennia. We will now focus on the immediate subject of the talk, namely our study area here. It's a bit smaller than this rectangle, but for better visuality, I've making it a bit wider. We will look at what we call Western Central Europe and the somewhat Eastern French borderlands. So that is an area around Mainz where I work and where I've studied, where I've worked for many years. When you really look at the dynamics of the Neolithic, we can distinguish, and also our academic forefathers have distinguished 3 periods, namely the early Neolithic, the middle Neolithic, and the late Neolithic, all sort of distinguishable through different ceramic traditions, but also in association with slightly different economies and also slightly different settlement structures. So this is nothing new. This has been developed as from the 1920 onwards. Before, it was based on really classical classical ceramic typology and sort of, as I said, economic classifications, but we now begin to realize that there is much more behind these traditional classifications. This is a chronological scheme saying basically the same thing. It begins with the early Neolithic, German Frühneolithicum, then the Middle Neolithic, and the Young Neolithic. That's the French terminology. So this threefold chronological scheme is visible throughout our work area and basically actually throughout temperate Europe. Recent archaeogenetic work on the on genome-wide genetic data was able to reproduce, and this is the interesting thing, was able to reproduce these classical chronological schemes. We can distinguish the population compositions of the early Neolithic, the Middle Neolithic, and the Young Neolithic, basically by their changing sort of by the changing mixture of presumably immigrant Neolithic groups from Western Anatolia and the changing composition and mixture with the various indigenous Mesolithic groups. And this goes throughout the entire Neolithic. Before, during the Paleolithic and Mesolithic, we have an entirely different population, and then the new population from Western Anatolia comes in, and we see it, as I said, a changing composition of Mesolithic components, and I will walk you through these processes. That is the beginning of the earliest Neolithic, the earliest phase of the linear pottery tradition. This is, by the way, this is, Harry, this is the early map that went into the map that I've just shown you for my dissertation. This is the extension of the earliest phase of the famous linear pottery culture, and it so shows it was drawn, really hand drawn, 30 years ago in the early 1990s, and it plots the various Mesolithic types or Mesolithic microliths that we found on early Neolithic sites. And we see changing microlith types, beginning here with a local microlith type, a so-called segment. It is split, broken, but is a typical segment, very typical for the late Mesolithic in the Hungarian, in the Western Hungarian region. And then we have various forms of trapezes. These are very local trapezes of the late Mesolithic in southwestern Germany. And then we have these triangular points that have their ancestry, their typological ancestry in the late Mesolithic in the West. And we also have a very elongated trapeze, which has its roots in the European North. So basically, what this map has told us and still tells us is that the advancing farming communities, which we know are of Western Anatolian genetic ancestry and which brought all the so-called Neolithic package with them, that these people must have encountered various regional Mesolithic groups. Genetically, however, we see in this early spread, here's the dates calibrated BCE, we only see that they mixed biologically with Eastern hunter-gatherers who had their, as I just shown before, who had their easternmost extension somewhere here, presumably. We know that also from archaeology, and it has been said even during the 1960s. And this map shows that, you know, with a segment here, that these people have been in contact. So the incoming farmers were in contact with a regional or local Eastern hunter-gatherer population. And from then on, this combined population with the admixture component of Eastern hunter-gatherers moves westward, also moves eastward, but we'll only look at the west, moves westwards and encounters regional Mesolithic populations. However, interestingly enough, the biological evidence at this point of resolution that we have do not show an influx of Western hunter-gatherer biological Western hunter-gatherer biological admixture with these populations. They knew each other culturally, they interacted with each other, they probably went hunting, but the evidence for biological admixture is very meager. The Eastern component can also be observed through the lithic. Through the lithic industry, we have a very typical Hungarian radiolarite, which was used widely in this area by the late Mesolithic local population in the area of origin of the LBK, and then expanded with this population westward. Although if you look at the quality, the material is beautiful, admittedly, but the quality of the material in opposition to the regional lithic materials here in the intermediate area is rather measly. So these people used a lithic raw material that they adopted culturally, in its area of origin. And took it with them westward, although there was no economic need. Again, this supports archaeologically, basically, sort of what we see here, genetically, the Eastern hunter-gatherer component within these early farming communities. And if we go down to the settlement scale, we can even see that these raw materials were not used by everyone, but only by a few lineages. Of course, that level of resolution has not yet been reached by genetics, and it may never be really, because of course we lack the skeletons that would give us the biological information required at this level. If we look to the west, the situation is somewhat dissimilar. As I said before, we have all these microliths and also pottery traditions that are heavily influenced by either late Mesolithic or other early farming populations or agropastoralists that have a Western ancestry. Or even a northern ancestry. However, while we see those on certain sites, like here Bruchenbrücken, which is not far from Mainz, also with raw material, which is not indigenous to this area, but which comes from 200 kilometers further west. So we know these people live together on one side with all these traditions, Western, Southwestern, and Northern in one site. All these populations did not mix biologically, but the LBK society, to our knowledge so far, stood rather rigidly constrained to their own biological profile, yet nevertheless was in contact with surrounding early Neolithic Western traditions or late Mesolithic local traditions. And this picture becomes even more clear when we look at the broader scale. I'm referring here to work done by Birgit Gehlen, who has taken the enormous task of georeferencing all the sites with the different Western pottery traditions that we have in this early Neolithic horizon, and also adding evidence from specific snails that are typical for the late Mesolithic. And we see that all these traditions here overlap in this Western area, but again, no indication for biological admixture, but a heavy cultural admixture with the biological populations living side by side. And this factor then becomes very interesting when we look at the Middle Neolithic. We all know that LBK eventually around 5000 calibrated BCE collapsed, possibly during a period that was slightly preceded by considerable violence. Anyway, when we look at the population curves, and I will show one later, we see that the population really decreased. And we have, out of this transition period, we see how the Middle Neolithic societies then formed. And here again, we can look at the archaeological evidence, and we can look at the genetic evidence, and we can look at Birgit Gehlen's work on snails. And what we see is, if we look at the initial Middle Neolithic, burials right from our area here, we see that certain Mesolithic components, like these trapezes, suddenly appear in these burials. Why in ceramic technology, they still retain their LBK tradition. But we also see, and this is really fantastic work done by Birgit, we also see that the snails that otherwise sort of are typical for late Mesolithic sites also appear in these early Middle Neolithic burials. And surprise, surprise, all of a sudden in the genetic evidence from this early Mesolithic, early Middle Neolithic period, we see that the Western hunter-gatherer Mesolithic makes its appearance into these farming populations with the archaeological Mesolithic heritage. So with the termination of the early Neolithic linear band pottery, the biological border that previously seems to have existed suddenly collapses, and these people mingle all together, mostly here in the Paris Basin and in the adjacent region. So it seems that whatever dictated the early Neolithic advance and their, let's call it biological rigidity, for want of a better term that right now, that suddenly disappeared. And these societies opened up and began also to mix biologically with the people that before they had only exchanged economic aspects with. By now, the Paris Basin has been studied extensively by our French colleagues. We've seen the emergence of a number of Middle Neolithic components that have partly an ancestry in the early Neolithic Eastern linear pottery tradition, have regional Mesolithic archaeological components, and are also heavily influenced by what is happening in southern France. And all this is found also in the biological components, where we can see that these populations, with a high, cultural dynamic, that these populations also entail biologically compositions from the south, from the local region, and also derivative compositions from the Anatolian population that 500 years before had made it into this region. So it's sort of there's a melting pot emerging on the basis of the early Neolithic with all the other components around. And a phenomenon that I've since many years been fascinated is that on the basis of these multicultural traditions emerging in the Paris Basin and elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere, we also see the emergence of what can only be called elites. We have enormously richly furnished burials in Brittany, but also on the other side of Europe, on the coast of the Black Sea. We'll leave them out a bit from the discussions. We have the depiction of what might have been politically leading figures in the Paris Basin. This is, as you might know, Mont Saint-Michel. No, it's not Mont Saint-Michel. It's the burial of Saint-Michel. Mont Saint-Michel is something different. The burial of Saint-Michel in Carnac, a burial which has a great number of alpine jade axe-heads, various varicid beads. So in this burial, we have an enormous accumulation of wealth that hitherto in the history of humankind, presumably in the history of humankind, has not been gathered for one single burial. We've begun to try to figure out how much work hours went into this single burial. It's very difficult to do, and we basically stopped because we had other things to do. But it is a really extreme peak and concentration of wealth right on the basis of these multicultural societies. Paris Basin is the same thing. We have these extremely long, elongated earthen mounds with one or two burials inside them. And all this happens when in the West we see the emergence and expansion of the distribution of the jade axis. So we have, compared to the early Neolithic, we have an entirely different social political structure with individuals that take great care and great expenditure in producing their social and political roles. And all this really, as I said, with a lot of Mesolithic traditions as well in these burials, like these arrowheads and other things. So all this on the basis of a combination of immigrant farming people and that mixture with the local Mesolithic. And these long mounds, these earthen long mounds, also extend into the area that we're dealing with here. That is an earthen long mound, very hard, well, not well known here from an area near Mainz. So the political differentiation that takes place in France at this time expands sort of eastward into the area that was left behind by the collapsing LBK societies. And this becomes even more obvious when we look into the Young Neolithic, the next succeeding period, which is characterized by the so-called Michelsberg culture, which emerged somehow under local southern French influences here in between the Paris Basin and the Ardennes, somewhere right here. It shows a lot of southern French influences in its ceramic traditions, but it is really a regional tradition, which from the Paris Basin then moves eastwards as far as central Germany and as far as southwestern Germany. So it is so to speak is the opposite expansion to the early Neolithic expansion, when the population moved from the west, from the east to the west. This population then moves from the west to the east. It picks up the political structure or aspects of this political structure with the tradition of high status burials in the Paris Basin. And just very recently, we were able to rediscover a huge burial mound on our major site here of Kapellenberg, which were probably or very likely two excerpts were found in the 19th century, which have the closest resemblances in the Paris Basin and in Brittany, showing that the demonstration of political power and might, together with these accents, had expanded into our area here. Unfortunately, these people lived a life that was can be best described with shifting sedentism or with an strong agro-pastoral component. So they didn't leave many burials behind. So currently the genetic data for this period is meager. But from the French side, we presume very much that the population that formed here in the Paris Basin also moved eastward with its strong composition of Western hunter-gatherers. What we also have in this period is the first evidence of a highly stratified society, which might have, that is yet unsure, which might have also biological components, but that was an idea I was fascinated with. But the new data might show that that we have to abandon this idea again. But what is very clear, we have a highly stratified society in which where these typical burials here contain one sort of community leading figure, which that was surrounded by a number of other people that were basically dumped into these burials with the to accompany this individual, this leading individual, into his death. And since we have quite a number of these typical burials, with one person buried properly and the others just dumped in across the Alpine mountains, we think that this is a regional, if not even local phenomenon. So even on local levels at this time, we would have a society which is highly stratified, at least into people that could easily die and were buried properly, and another group of people that were forced into death to accompany this person in his death. So the political differentiation was not on a supra-regional level, but also possibly on a regional and even a local level. And that sort of political rigidity in these societies is transferred into the succeeding late Neolithic, whereas during the early Neolithic, early Neolithic LBK, we see a number of cases with considerable violence between groups, but we do not see these manifestations of political differentiation that characterizes first the Middle Neolithic and then certainly also the succeeding Young Neolithic. So we can picture at least the early Young Neolithic period. We can picture this as a highly stratified society in which we possibly have supra-regional leaders, at least for the beginning, like the individual buried at Kapellenberg, and then regional leaders and possibly even village heads, which still had a considerable power. And this was then followed by a number of, let's call them free farmers, and then even slaves and war prisoners. I've taken this graph from the Spanish records of the terminal Mississippian culture that the Spanish invaders encountered in Eastern North America. And I think we have some reason to compare these societies at least in their political complexity. And presumably, and this has been published before, and I maintain it, also a number of these people that were that decomposed and were dumped carelessly in ditches and pits represent the slaves and the war prisoners. Whereas, unfortunately, because of the lifestyle, shifting sedentism, we do not have the normal population well represented. There's actually just this burial ground in eastern France, from which we have a certain insight into this population. Okay, let's look at the overall dynamics. And this I've taken a graph made by Kohler et al. On the differentiation of wealth globally, or comparing comparing the old world with the new world. This is the new world, as you can see, Cahokia, Aztec villages, and this is the old world, and you can see that the Western Central European Neolithic, with some of the sites that I've talked about, Buchenbrücken and Feying, that's all early LBK, they fall well within, so to speak, the global range of wealth differentiation. There's nothing surprising about this graph. This is something that one really would expect. What makes this more fascinating is when we look at the dynamics that are behind this great blurb that I've just shown. What I've plotted here is basically what I've said. We have an early incoming farming population from the Near East, a very biologically closed population with which is comparatively not egalitarian, of course, but which has a low socio-political complexity, with some maybe leading figures, which however are difficult to discern and have more to be inferred than can be pinpointed archaeologically. So basically a society in which equal status was emphasized, and maybe just some individuals sort of were slightly buried with more material, but possibly not. But this then is the first population curve. Then we have the LBK collapse after a period of warring. Then all of a sudden we have the middle Neolithic population curve. So we see population ditches in between. Then we have the emergence of what I called incipient chieftains, influenced by the Western high status burials, again tied to a population increase. Then, funnily enough, in our region here in Western Central Europe, we have a population decline again, and then out of the composition of the people that left the Paris Basin and went into Western Central Europe with a Michelsberg culture, we have another population increase, and then what I call the emergence of complex chieftains, because not only do we have prominent burial mounds, but we also have the emergence of huge and heavily populated, large, extensive settlements. That's a phenomenon that has been observed throughout Western Eurasia, that around 3,700 throughout this population peaks, we see a sudden upspring of these huge settlements mounds, at least from the Ukraine westwards. And then we have another complexity collapse to a dark period in between, which is paralleled by by a population complex. And then we have the late Neolithic advance with the Yamnaya steppe population. So basically we have three population peaks which are tied to slightly different economies and considerably different socio-political structures. And if we look at the material that was just recently published by the Kiel Research Group on the jade axis and the copper axis, we see that the population dynamics that we have here during the early Neolithic, middle Neolithic, and young Neolithic, three population peaks with population drops in between, so booms and busts in between. They are basically reproduced by the economic activities in the same region. So we have an early economic activity in the distribution of lithic raw materials. Then the middle Neolithic and particularly the young Neolithic is sort of paralleled by the economic activities circled around the jade axis. So what I want to say with this image is that the population peaks sort of are paralleled by the economic peaks and busts in this area. And this refers back to what I said at the beginning, that we have this classic typological schemes, which were developed 100 years ago, that they're actually filled by a number of components, economically and biologically changes between these three succeeding booms and busts that sort of fill up our own classificatory system, saying again that these old schemes had their right in their own. You know, there were typological differences, but they also mean something population-wise and economically, and also from the political structure. The question now is, what forced these dynamics? You know, what is behind all this? Is it just population booms and busts? No, people becoming more fertile and then less fertile, or something that cannot be the entire story. So we looked again at the early linear pottery culture, because this is the best archaeologically represented entity here. We looked at the densely spaced archaeological material, and we looked into the literature and said, okay, what all has been called a trigger in the past 20, 30, 50 years? That would be economics. Okay, we know economics also follow the same dynamics. Population, clear. Land use is something that we don't really have good data for. And we also looked at something that we called social diversity, or now social cohesion. So we extracted a component from the archaeological record that would reflect an entirely social dynamic. And we did so by referring to Tujfeld's social identity theory, which distinguishes between how societies identify themselves with their own in-group and distinguish themselves towards other groups. So group identity plays a major role in this theory, and we can see, if we look at the LBK evidence, we can see that group identity and group distinguishing, even within LBK societies, is a major component. Again, LBK, we have simple farming, lineage-based, dispersed settlements, and as I said, no marked hierarchies. And we know, I'm referring here to the work of my colleague Christoph Strien, also at Mainz University. We know from his utterly detailed work in Southwest Germany that we can find clear distinguishing markers in the pottery, clear distinguishing markers on the settlement level, where we can see regional and local traditions which have been maintained through various generations. And we can also see this on a regional level, all through these pottery markers, saying that these people took great care in signaling their social identities, whatever there may be, subgroups, political fractions, and other things on the pottery. And they did so on various levels. That's the most interesting part, because the pottery decoration is composed of various levels, so to speak. We were also able to distinguish between a more general social identity social cohesion component and a more individual social cohesion component. I'm happy to explain this later on. This is rather complicated. And all these various levels are encoded on one single pot. And that makes it a wonderful archive that can be transferred into a time series. We did that for my colleague's study region here in Southwest Germany. And we were able to distinguish two different curves of social political dynamics, where the individual and group-oriented curve sort of produces the larger curve, which is representative for the entire early Neolithic society. And when we plotted this curve in comparison to a population curve, we can see that it not necessarily follows the same dynamic as the population curves, which then led us to the conclusion in saying that it's not the population curves that is determinant for the dynamics that we see, but that it is rather the social coherence that determines the entire following effects: population, economy, everything. Everything, so is our idea, everything is built on the successive stages of social coherence within these early farming groups. So our hypothesis is that these fluctuations are basically determined by how these early societies, integrated at the beginning, then became more and more and more diverse, and then collapsed in their own social cohesion. And these basically determines these fluctuations. To what extent, we want to find out in the future by quantifying all this and comparing it to the other parameters. And I was very happy to have seen recently a publication by colleague Martin Schäfer and my colleague Tim Kohler on the southwestern North American societies in a very arid region, on a much denser database, but also early farming societies, these Pueblo cultures, and they came to the same conclusion that the way these early farming societies reacted to external influences, in that case droughts, basically relied on how stable these societies were socially. So if these societies were stable socially, if their social coherence operated well, these people were much better able to face external threats. And we find the same thing. Basically, the way or the degree to which with which societies can face external threats really depends on how well they operate internally. And that's something that we want in the future, that we want to expand and project really on our modern day society. And basically it seems that we're able to project this simple template that I've just shown, this simple template here, also on our modern day societies, which again then allows to use these early farming societies, be they 7,000 years ago, or just 1,500 years or 1,200 years, like the Pueblo case, that these early farming societies sort of embed or follow processes which still determine our highly industrial global society today. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I want to start just with a small question, because all this social complexity in the Middle Neolithic is quite interesting, because during a lot of years we have looking for a mixture of hunter-gatherers and farming societies in the early Neolithic, and now the archaeological evidence seems to point out that this mixture is in real during the Middle Neolithic. So this increase in the social complexity is related with an increase in the economical practices, for example, with the more presence of crops or fields or something like that in Central Europe?
Well, if we only knew, if we only knew what we see specifically through Maite Rivouillat's and other research is that we have very different trajectories across Europe. For instance, the situation is different in France than in Western Central Europe. In France, and particularly southern France, we see an early admixture and a much more intensified admixture with the between the incoming farmers and the local Mesolithic groups. That is not the case so far with the linear pottery tradition. We know the linear pottery societies are highly dynamic and are very effective in their agricultural practices and in their system that they developed, but somehow they collapsed because of reasons that we still not understand. We know climate has been a component. Previously, I thought climate was the major factor, but our new research, unfortunately not yet published, shows that climate was never a great factor. It was just an additional component. And from the evidence, from the detailed evidence that we showed, that I showed, is that the decomposition of these societies, the social decomposition of these societies, led way to the overall collapse. How then this extreme dynamic that happens in the succeeding period can be explained, I don't know. It's something that I've been cracking my head about. We know we have, we think for some reason that salt as a commodity might have played a role, because the foci of extreme wealth are on either side of Europe on the coastline, so that might be something. But why specifically these mixed societies all of a sudden became almost global for their world traders in salt, and were able to combine this with political aspiration and success, and maybe also some ideological success, is entirely unclear to me. It's something that I observe, and I see this enormous increase in wealth in one burial. There's a number of them. If you try to plot this, the concentration of wealth in one of these burials, and if you compare it to a simple farmer, it's possibly the wealth difference is possibly greater than between Bezos and a normal American today. How that happened within a few hundred years, or maybe less than, maybe just 3-4 generations, is something that I really don't understand. It's entirely unclear to me. All I know is it collapses again after a few hundred years. It wasn't something that was stable. The succeeding young Neolithic societies don't have these burials anymore, and we might have leading political positions. but people did not take care in representing this wealth combined to a single individual or just a very small group. It's something that fascinates me, but it's something that I don't understand. I've looked around in Western Eurasia, nowhere else so far, I haven't looked at Africa, but one would know, nowhere else, possibly on the globe, do we see these concentrations of wealth compared to Europe at this time. I mean, yeah, something that one could talk about but you will not come to a conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. And how do you think this scenario in Central Europe correlate with the South, with the Mediterranean basin?
Yeah,
because it's quite different.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to follow the Mediterranean evidence closely. The community is extremely extensive, and the traditional connections between these two communities never really existed. To be frank, even within France, the community that works in the Paris Basin and the community that works in the French Midi, they're not, and for Central Europe, you have the Alps in between. So every once in a while, we look there, but what I realize is, even with the little knowledge that I have, is as I've said before, also biologically, we see very different dynamics. It seems to sort of maybe come a bit together during the young Neolithic, when we have the widest extension of these exants. They were, the raw material comes from the Western Alps, that is more or less within the reach of the Mediterranean region, and we see they also expand slightly into Italy, but they hardly expand into the Iberian Peninsula, for instance. So it's different things. And if you go, if you look at the third region in Europe, at Northern Europe, it's an entirely different story as well. If you take the British Isles, for instance, or Southern Scandinavia, it all happens a little later, and it has a different dynamic. We see when we have this population collapse in temperate Europe, and just as from today, we certainly know that the plague was no factor in that. It's something that we just see happening. We see a parallel uprise in population in the European North. So there's also a different dynamic. But then again, if you look at Europe, since when do we have the same supra-regional dynamics? Maybe only after the Second World War, with the so-called Great Acceleration. It's then only that things happen more and more coherently at the same time. And not even then, maybe only since the 2000s. But now it's crumbling apart again. Never mind, man.
I've got a couple of questions for you. Brilliant. First off, brilliant talk. And secondly, apologies to the people watching now. There seems to have been a mix-up with the timings. So Facebook said it's notified people now that the talk is taking place, when in fact it was an hour ago, due to Central European time versus GMT.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. But on the plus side, it is being recorded and
I was going to say, yeah.
So, and also I'll just say then, if people do have questions and of course have missed the talk, please, I'm sure you'll be happy to answer those via email, Detlef, I'm assuming, provided you're not going to be overwhelmed with thousands. Anyway, yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So
let me just go ahead. I'll drink some water. I'm thirsty.
Yeah, for sure. So the first question concerns this this late Mesolithic flint typology, which you specified at the start of the talk has its roots in the sort of present day Mongolian region. Now, how do you explain the movement of this typology into, say, let's say, present day Europe? I mean, is it a reflection of people coming in from the east, or is it a reflection of knowledge transfer, or indeed a reflection of transmission, passing of materials, artifacts? How would you go about explaining that?
Well, first, it spans almost 15,000 years. Yeah. So it presumably evolved, and I've just referred to the literature that has been published previously, that it emerged somewhere in present-day Mongolia. But then it is also technologically, it is very effective. You use a pressure to detach a blade, which has a perfect ratio between length and width. So you get an enormous amount of cutting edge out of these blades, and they are not very curved, but they're rather straight. So once this technology was developed, it was something that, with a little expertise, I failed, by the way, but others didn't. With a little expertise, you can produce a lot of very good raw blades, out of which you can work out a lot of different microliths, as it was important for these hunting and gathering people. So the technology is just good. And if you follow it up, as I tried for the most western parts, you can see that at least for the Holocene, you can see it's a combination between the technology spreading just through passing as a technology, and it even if you look at it closer, you see some slight changes from region to region within the technology. So it is passed as a technological complex, but it is also passed through possibly people moving. So it's really it's a combination of things. For instance, these Eastern hunter-gatherers never reached Western Europe, yet parts of this technology reached Western Europe. If you go into the Iberian Peninsula, the way to produce these regular blades persists until the Young Neolithic, I think, and it is very characteristic for the southern French chasséant. So it's a composition of various things, of which at one point you have people moving with it, but on the other it's just contacts between groups where they change a slight component here and there, and also the microliths change and take their very regional very regional types evolve, but all based on this technology. But what I wanted to show is that the times have not been stable and solid before the Neolithic. There was movement of people also during the earlier parts of the Holocene. We presume this for the glacial, because we know people had to move because the glaciers came. So populations have been changing there, obviously, but many people still think of the Mesolithic as a period where people just stood around their campfires and walked to the forest back and forth, and that was it for thousands and thousands of years. But no, they didn't. They went far, and they knew people. At least a few of them knew people that lived far away, and they had these supra-regional exchange networks, which are evident mostly by the snails, more than the lithic. The lithics are if you look at the lithic distribution systems, they're rather regional, but the snails show that these people must have had means of getting in touch with further regions.
Sorry, yes, this is very interesting because there is another hypothesis, the hypothesis of the Thomas Perrin in French. He speaks around the pression for the blades start more or less in the Caspian, in the north of Africa. And for me, very interesting because you speak about this dissemination is from east of Europe, but in the same time, Perrin explained he thinks from North Africa. What do you think?
I should say that I've had this discussion with my French colleagues for quite some time. And this discussion has been going on, I think, ever since the 1950s. And it has gone back and forth. But now with the more recent C14 evidence and also the archaeogenetic evidence, I see, and some of them see, that the Eastern hypothesis is currently overweighing. I know the North African evidence, and I've worked in Africa myself. You know, I would have found it equally fascinating if it would have come from Africa. It doesn't matter to me. In fact, I would have sympathized with the idea more than with the East, probably. You know, but you know, the current evidence shows that this tradition comes from the East and then moves westwards, and the occurrences in Africa are accidentally slightly earlier there because we lack the missing link in Sicily. So this is due to populations that, you know, yeah, it's a touchy subject. It's a touchy subject.
It's interesting though, these this expansion, dispersal coming over from, let's say, the East, so to speak, mainly because some colleagues have been working on the dispersal of pottery as well.
Yeah.
And in a similar sort of fashion, put it this way, you're not going to get that high resolution from, say, archaeogenetics and or whether or not there's enough skeletal material in order to say, well, this group interacted with this group at this time, and then 200 years later, this other group interacted with this other group, and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly you have the movement all across Eurasia into Europe. So presumably, again, these pots, some of these early pots as well from Japan and Far East Asia, and then westwards into, let's say, the Urals in Russia, and then the Caspian area, and then stepping further west, the vessels were quite large. So I'm assuming that it is, in some cases, probably knowledge transfer, as well as in some cases the transfer of materials, like, here, look at this vessel, you look like a friendly hunter-gatherer group, exchange or mix with these other groups, and then they either adopt it, fashion it themselves, and then pass it on. So I assume that. Do you have any thoughts for that, or you seem to be agreeing with me?
I do, but then again, if you've looked into it, it's also a touchy subject. You know, some people, and I count myself into this group. Some people say, okay, it's all, you know, one big Eurasian tradition, which has its origins somewhere in Eastern Asia, be it Northern China, Southern China might also be counted in, and even Japan. And then, you know, it's a technology that was passed on also over several thousand years. You know, it's also something that goes back into the high glacial, 18,000 years ago. I don't even know what the earliest dates are now. And then you see a stepward movement across the same, basically across the same belt, forest belt that is also traversed by this blade industry. But then some in Russia, some colleagues in Russia note that there's this gap of about 3,000 kilometers east of the Urals, where they don't have a link between East Asia and Western Asia, and they maintain that their tradition are only a local, indigenous, independent invention of pottery, which does look somewhat the same as the East, you know, and then sort of that this Russian or southeastern Russian tradition then spreads through the Russian woodlands into basically into northern Belgium, you know, with the Swifterband traditions. We'll just have to wait until further. I know Peter Hommel's work, and I much agree with what he says. You know, I see a broad belt of interlinking groups and regions over thousands of years, which have passed on the tradition. Some then moved, others didn't. You know, sort of a contact zone all across Eurasia. And if you look into the genetic detail, you find evidence for this. You find evidence for this. And I should say, you know, if you sit back and think about it, it is not so surprising. It is not so surprising that we have this broad contact belt.
Great. Thanks for that. I also have one final question about maybe about the specifics of one of your graphs. You said on the y-axis you had site counts. Now,
yeah, for the population.
Yeah, it's just a broad question. How did you get around the biases associated with those? Because of course, you know, there's so many biases when just presenting site counts against.
I'm quite aware.
Yeah.
I'm quite aware. But it's the only homogeneous data set that we have for all these three periods. So that's why I took it. What is unfortunately a bit shaded in this graph is that the C14 dates from that very region are plotted behind it. So the site counts is just one reference amongst others. We just didn't have had time to work this up in greater detail. One could, I'm quite aware, but we would have to go through a lot of detailed information to get around the biases that we're all quite aware of. But it should just give a first impression. Now, in better research areas, we can come up with much higher resolution and better data. Not for the specific region right here, unfortunately. But the general tendency is, you know, is shown just simply by the some C14 curve. All I wanted to show is that we have these three. That's what it was all about. Mm. The detail is unimportant here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's such a useful tool to present the data, and that's basically what you're going for. And I agree, because playing around with some big data sets of myself, it's what's the best way to show it. And it does. It's nice that it mirrors the other publications by some of your colleagues who you pointed out to as well. It's almost just an overlap of your chart versus their chart. So that's
it just came out 2 weeks ago, and I didn't have time to combine them. When I find a bit more space, I'll do that, and it'll become even more obvious. It'll become even more obvious. We'll plot them and just take those from that very region, and it's very obvious, and it's nice to see.
Yeah,
it's nice to see. And what I, being old school myself, I find it great to see that those people that 100 years ago, established these periods, and they were always criticized during the 70s and 80s and 90s that these were bare, just concepts that didn't have any real meaning. That nowadays, with all this different data, it shows that there's real dynamics behind it, even to the extent that they have a genetic component.
Yeah.
Now, the Potter people debate. It was many years ago.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. Well, I'll keep an eye on yourself and further publications in due course and what have you. But again, thank you ever so much for agreeing to give this talk and doing it so well, and especially given the automated movement all the time, which is great. But
I've remembered. I took it from an automated presentation, and I had never noticed it when I worked on it, because when you do things, it stops. It's only when you leave the mouse that it goes on automatically. Sorry for that.
No, not a problem.
No problem.
I'm congratulating you for your efforts and endeavors, because it is what it is. No, so thanks so much. And just a quick reminder that we've got another series of talks lined up for later on in the year, I think from September onwards. And of course, I'll make sure that the timings for those are precise. Anyway, again, Detlef, thank you ever so much. And I'll pass over to Juan or Miriam in case they have any final comments or thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to say. Just thank you for this talk. It was really, really interesting. And of course, as always, a lot of food of thought. So thank you for your contribution and your collaboration to our seminars.
Yeah, thank you. Only say we will send the information the next weeks, but probably the next conference will be in September 8th, and the conference is around the North Africa, the Neolithic for North Africa, and will be Julio Lucarini will be the conference. Okay, and thank you for this conference.
I will listen to the one on North Africa, of course.
Yeah.
But it's at the same time as the EEHA, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's at the same time as the EEHA.
Yes, always is the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.